August 20th, 2021 was a date that changed the fate of many families in the People's Republic of China. The nation, known for its radical methods when it comes to population control, passed into law a policy that allowed Chinese families to have 3 children per household. For the country and its citizens that had lived under the controversial one-child policy for decades, the change was shocking, but its effects were not as immediate. As notifications hit phones and news outlets across the nation, childbearing was all anyone could talk about. Popular Chinese social media sites like Weibo and WeChat reported high engagement, with some posts about the recent policy change getting 400 million views and hundreds of thousands of comments. Yet despite the news and the positive reinforcement by the Communist Party, many young couples weren't quick to answer the call of the Chinese government, and the birth and fertility rate continues to drop. It's a symptom that first popped up when the government loosened the policy back in 2016, permitting married couples to have 2 children. The initial burst of babies in 2017 stalled soon after, and a 2020 census revealed that China has had their lowest birth rate since the 1960s, despite economic growth and urban development. Married and single Chinese adults aren't confident about having more than 1 child, and others are holding off completely. Combine this with an aging population and constant workforce shortages, it's looking like China might have more in common with Italy, Germany and Japan, who have all reported low birth rates and aging citizens. With the one-child policy's effects still felt today, economic damage and employment strains are just the beginning. For many, the newest changes may be a case of too little too late. Founded in 1949, the People's Republic of China has always had a high population. China is geographically smaller than Russia and Canada, and yet their population in the 50s tripled those of their counterparts. With 540 million citizens, China was rapidly growing, far outranking their communist neighbor Russia by 440 million people. With China so young, controlling the fertility rate and family planning were at the forefront of every national address. Chairman Mao Zedong observed that the population was increasing due to the demand for farmers to have family laborers. Though nothing was set in stone, families were encouraged to keep their family size to a minimum and focus on building the young nation. Most who chose smaller families were voluntary, but the average number of people per household was still 6. As time went on, the government rolled out propaganda that painted 1 or 2 children as part of the ideal Chinese family. They also presented pay raises and social incentives. But in 1958, China's population would face a dramatic and painful decrease: the Great Chinese Famine. From 1958 to 1961, millions of Chinese people suffered one tragedy after the next as natural disasters, climate fluctuations, government policies, and military movement shook the largely agriculturally dependent country. China spun into a dark period. Numbers have been muted by some records, but it is believed that anywhere from 10 to 47 million people perished as a result of starvation and malnutrition. The famine also greatly affected fertility and any desire to bear children, making the 60s a decade with the lowest birth rates in China at the time. However, as the famine eased up, China's population rose. By the end of the 1970s, China's population neared 1 billion, leading to a push for family planning methods. Things changed radically though when Chairman Mao Zedong passed in 1976. A blunt and results-driven leader, Deng Xiaoping, took his place. By then, the government had voiced concern over the population and its strain on the economy. They viewed the 969 million citizens as a roadblock to the plans of quick economic expansion that would overtake European and American development. They also felt that the growing population would be too much for the Chinese government to facilitate, and the strain on resources like water, electricity, and food would be overbearing. And then finally, on September 25th, 1980, the Communist Party of China announced that all families were to adhere to a new policy that would limit them to 1 child. The National Health and Family Planning Commission oversaw the policy and immediate enforcement. The rewards for going along with the rules included pay raises, access to better jobs, improved government services, longer maternity and paternity leave, and even access to better housing and healthcare. Penalties for going against the policy, however, were life-altering and permanent. Families with more than 1 child would have to pay a penalty fee that could go as high as $1.2 million, and others would experience sanctions like having their property seized and being blocked from accessing government services. Salaries of such parents would be reduced, while other companies would altogether refuse to hire those with more than 1 child during this period. Perhaps the most alarming elements occurred in the early 80s. Reports of forced termination of pregnancies and sterilization were so frequent that organizations like the UN Human Rights Commission and Amnesty International publicly condemned the government's actions. The policy also led to huge gender gaps and a rise in gender inequality. male children were often favored in traditional Chinese families because only men could inherit land or property, and men were seen as primary breadwinners, so having a boy became the number one priority for many families. During the 40 years of state-run family planning, many families put up female children for adoption, which led to tens of thousands of Chinese girls being taken in by American and European families in the 1990s and early 2000s. As many sought desperate measures to obtain a boy child, reports of abandoned or terminated female children rose. But there is a flip side to this. For those who kept their girl child, all investment and priority went into building them up, increasing the literacy rate amongst female children in China. These female children accessed educational and social opportunities that may not have existed if they were male. Another bizarre result of the one-child policy lies in the fate of the second or third children. Though the numbers are unconfirmed, it's rumored that nearly 13 million children were undocumented and labeled non-existent during the one-child era. The state did not recognize these children. Hiding them was hard enough, with enforcers constantly threatening jail time and harassment upon discovery of pregnancies. If the child was born, it meant no access to schooling, formal healthcare, and employment. Parents of such children struggled to make legitimate lives for their kids, as they did not have official government records like ID numbers or birth certificates. Many families who couldn't afford the high penalty fees for having a second or third child had to deal with constantly running from officials and hiding their pregnancies. With no access to formal education and no possibility of holding a bank account, these kids were in a state of limbo that the economy still deals with today. Of course, as in all cases, there were exceptions. The higher-ups in Chinese society who could afford the penalty often had more children without the fear of enforcers at their heels. Parents who bore twins the first time around were also left alone. As the policy went on, the government made exceptions for farmers who needed the workforce and those in rural areas who had had a female firstborn or a firstborn child with disabilities. The Chinese government boasts prevention of 400 million potential births since the policy was enforced. But other observers state that the population was already on the decline by 1980 and that the radical policy was not needed. Though the notorious policy was effectively thrown out in 2015 for a two-child policy, and now recently in 2021 for a three-child policy, the one-child policy is still alive and active in China's modern society at different levels. Today, China has 1.4 billion people, and while that sounds like a large number, the figure from the 2020 census shows that the policy has greatly altered China. The Chinese government states that a 2.1 birth average per woman is necessary to have a stable population, and they currently have an average of 1.8. 2020 recorded the lowest births in modern Chinese history, with 12 million births, a great decrease from 2019's 14.6 million births. So why isn't the loosened policy working? For most working Chinese citizens, the cost far outweighs the benefits. The women who grew up in the one-child era had heavier investments in their education and prioritized career growth and the pursuit of knowledge over having a family and remaining home as a caregiver. Women in urban populations, which make up 63% of the Chinese population, have more options today, and some are choosing to hold off on children until they've met their career goals. In the growing and demanding Chinese economy, the working population has adapted to longer working hours as well, leaving out any extra time to take care of a child. For Chinese millennials, children are barely an option as a lack of sustainable employment has led to many increasing their work hours just to balance their finances. Then there is a little problem that the gender gap created. There's an epidemic of single Chinese men who have fewer women their age that they can start a family with. Currently, there are 35 million more men than women in China. And to break it down even further, for every 109 men, there's only 100 women. So even if a man is financially stable and ready for marriage, they will struggle with finding a companion. This has led to a concerning trend of trafficking women from other Asian countries to offset the imbalance. Most of these reasons, though, can be eclipsed by the high cost of living, matched with the lack of adequate childcare options, and the weakened workforce due to the growing age gap. For a child born during the one-child policy, taking care of their aging parents without any help from siblings can increase the cost of their living, as the parents take the place of a potential child. The government did speak about cash incentives, support, and stronger childcare, but an actionable plan hasn't been enforced, leaving many without confidence. So the workforce remains strained, and those working decreased by the decade. This is most evident in China's northeastern belt known as Dongbei. The region boasts a population of 110 million people and was once a developmental hub due to its richness in iron and coal. Strict enforcement of the one-child policy here led to low birth rates, as the average per woman was 0.56 in 2015. Today, the area is full of older citizens as urban migration and industrial development has moved companies and their employees to bigger cities. What's left is a reflection of China's 63% working age population, that's down from 70% in 2010 and is predicted to decline to 50% by 2050. The government has even considered adjusting the retirement age to curb the issue. These numbers highlight the biggest success of the one-child policy, convincing the public that one child is ideal and enough. After decades of hearing about the ideal family, it doesn't seem socially acceptable or encouraged to pursue having more children, despite newer policies. But it might not be too late. Unlike Italy, Germany, or Japan, which have aged and significantly fewer populations, China still has time. The large population offers some security, but it'll take decades of the same amount of constant reinforcement, societal acceptance, heavy marketing, and unlearning to reverse the effects of a practice that has become second nature.